Hey there, Mr. Terry here, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. As many of you are aware, one of the hot things that people talk about in the history YouTube community is President Woodrow Wilson. Some of my YouTube friends, like Cynical Historian, Chris from Blogging Through History, are very outspoken against Wilson. However, I have never matched their energy with that. Not because I glorify him, that's definitely not the case, but I've never matched them in talking about him in the conversation of worst president of the United States. So with all the Wilson hate I've been hearing, I wanted to check out a video that I just got recommended to me. It's from Monsieur Z, and his video says, Woodrow Wilson did nothing wrong. Now right away, that is a stretch to say, but maybe it's just clickbaity. I guess we'll find out here. All right, I'm going to link the original video down below, and let me know what you think about his arguments about Wilson, and what do you think about him? I'm going to let you know along the way. All right, stay tuned to my channel. We've got more episodes of History Showdown that are going to start back up again now that the holiday season is ending. We got some great matchups with some great YouTubers coming up. All right, let's get started. All right, I think this is the second video I've seen of Monsieur Z, and it seems like he's got kind of an interesting reputation. I haven't seen enough of the content to really know about, I don't know, anything controversial or whatever. Let's see what we got.
American President Woodrow Wilson. Historically has been regarded highly, though in recent times has been shot down and relegated to the bottom of the barrel, and seemingly from across the political spectrum as well. Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Greens, Liberals, and Conservatives increasingly appear to carry a negative opinion of Wilson for any number of individual or combination of reasons.
What's kind of interesting because he's coming from he's a Southern Democrat, but had these like progressive views that matched up quite a bit with the more progressive Republicans of the North. So he was already kind of weird for his time and nebulous that way.
While Wilson has suffered these blows to his reputation, almost paradoxically has another president from the same era risen to tremendous popularity in spite of many of these same, if not more extreme, actions and ideological leanings. That president was the much beloved Theodore Roosevelt, and we'll be referencing him and the progressive movement of the day repeatedly throughout this video.
Who, we'll see if he says, if he brings in the election that ended up splitting votes when Teddy Roosevelt, broke off from the Republican Party and ran with the Bull Moose Party that ended up actually kind of paving the way for him, for Wilson to kind of sneak into the presidency with like 40, what was it, low 40s, I think, in the percent of the vote.
Most often pinned on Wilson are accusations of tyranny, racism, imperialism, hypocrisy, incompetence, warmongering, etc. Great hate seems to stem from a belief that he was particularly responsible for actions which in reality were the product of years of progressive policy, from a belief that he somehow altered or compromised the progressive movement, from a belief that he stood widely apart from other progressives of the day, and alone must shoulder the scorn for all which might have gone wrong during those decades. Moreover, that so much wrong occurred during those days, when in fact we find great justification and acceptance from the public of the time in regard to actions taken by the Wilson administration.
Yeah, I mean, the accusations about Wilson are definitely, in retrospect, a lot more than they were maybe in the current frame, although there's plenty of voices, you know, during his presidency, but has definitely heated up in the more modern actually we're getting. You know how some presidents will get a little bit more popular as time goes on, maybe afterwards, but yeah, sometimes it can go the other direction. He's kind of one of those.
Of course, I'll preface this and later conclude as well by stating that I do not personally agree with all of the policies and ideologies of Woodrow Wilson, but rather recognize a very unjust mischaracterization of a historic figure and feel it only right to correct such misunderstanding through insight.
So I guess it's not Wilson did nothing wrong. Great way to click on, though. I guess clickbaity.
Wilson has been accused of taking the use of government power to unprecedented and unjustified heights in his creation of new business regulations, establishing the income tax, establishing the Federal Reserve, and prosecuting anti-American and extremist.
There's been income taxes before, but yeah, much more representative of today. He's blasting through a whole bunch of things real quick. I want to make sure I get them.
Establishing the income tax, establishing the Federal Reserve, and prosecuting anti-American and extremist individuals during and immediately following the American entry into the Great War.
Sure. Espionage Act, Sedition Acts, I'm sure he'll get into those.
On regulation, Wilson's federal...
Now, not unprecedented, though, for things to change during wartime. At every major war we've had in the United States history, there has been, I guess you would say in some way, a suspension of certain civil rights, certain civil liberties during wartime. You can go back to the Civil War at the very latest with suspension of habeas corpus from President Lincoln. And then even the ideas of like drafts have come into discussion. But anyways, criticisms of the government or the military action, these type of things have been enhanced in every major war in the United States.
Trade Commission was a more efficient successor to Roosevelt's Bureau of Corporations, which could not regulate but only investigate and bring such findings before a court, allowing unscrupulous businesses to navigate loopholes during this long process. Wilson's FTC,
well, understand this is a continuation of the progressive movement that was of this kind of legacy of like trust busting and some corrupt practices. These are the things that again were becoming more popular amongst people voted around the turn of the century, give or take a decade. Because we're talking about the runaway wealth and problems, I guess, that came from the Industrial Revolution, the Second Industrial Revolution, and trying to rein in the power of big business into the country and into politics.
Their hand could now investigate and act immediately, bringing a rapid end to illegal and unfair practices, as well as prevent the formation of monopolies and trusts before they had a chance to establish themselves by giving the government direct oversight and final say whenever large businesses decided to merge. On taxation, Wilson merely built upon the work and infrastructure of his predecessors, Roosevelt and Taft, by putting the previously established 16th Amendment, which authorized Congress to collect taxes on income, to work. Wilson's tax was a mere 1 to 6% for only the top 3% of the population.
Yeah. People will freak out when they look at what tax rates were, what they used to be. Now you get up to, the 20s or 30s, depending on the situation and depending on your income and things like that. But when you're talking about like single digits, it's definitely a cry to the past.
Revenue accumulated from this tax, allowing Wilson to cut tariffs by nearly half and thus significantly reduce the price of imported products for the entire country. On the Federal Reserve, it must be stressed that Wilson
you guys hear that? That was such a huge thing that ended up being a justification was the reduction of tariffs, wanting to have more open trade and exporting and things like that, to kind of on the backs of the Industrial Revolution too, of limiting tariffs, so that form of income going down and then being replaced by taxing those that are benefiting from the lack of tariffs. That makes sense? Hitting the same demographic almost.
Inherited the Federal Reserve Plan from a commission originally established during the Roosevelt administration, which sought to create a centralized banking system now that the U.S. had gone from a regional and developing power to a global power.
Federal Reserve.
Wilson, not wanting to establish a central bank per se, given the country's bumpy history with such systems, modified the plan by introducing elements which turned into a semi-private, semi-public institution. However, its function remained largely the same as was intended by the commission, and the new plan was largely praised by progressives of the day, who saw it as a solution to America's economic instability. Whether it was successful is extremely questionable. And
there were economic problems and dips before the Great Depression, but we also saw that the Federal Reserve wasn't able to prevent the Great Depression either. And big criticisms of it today is that it can kind of hold a lot of the economy and I guess the economic decisions and health of the United States kind of in its hands, outside of democratic processes, outside of, say, Congress and things like that, acting like its own very, very powerful entity.
And what Wilson can be faulted for, if truly the Reserve is a faulty system, is merely that he happened to be the man to sign it into existence. Had Roosevelt, Taft, or any other progressive of the day been in his position, it almost certainly would have been created regardless. On the Espionage and Sedition Acts, America had faced internal strife for some time by the presidency of Wilson, primarily actions perpetrated.
Hear what he was saying, if you didn't catch his kind of thesis. Part of that was creation of the Federal Reserve was not necessarily something that Wilson just kind of pulled out of thin air. It was seemingly a natural progression of progressives at that time, responding to the economic system, I guess, the United States was undergoing here in the early 1900s.
By recent immigrants who subscribed to anarchist and socialist ideology. Presidency of Wilson, primarily actions perpetrated by recent immigrants who subscribed to anarchist and socialist ideologies from Europe and engaged in violent action against American citizens. With the outbreak of the
McKinley was was seen by many as the representation of how big business has completely taken over the government. So the most donated to presidential candidates ever. Look into that election with William Jennings Bryan, and yeah, it's talked about, and you can look at it as one of the most donated and financially pushed presidential elections we've ever had. People say McKinley was basically just a plant by robber barons, so that's where you're going to get his dislike by many people, which also helped definitely push in eventually the progressive era when you get with from the presidency with like Teddy Roosevelt. So like where William Jennings Bryan had failed, you're going to get Teddy Roosevelt coming in, and then the progressive presidents that followed.
War, fears abounded of foreign actors attempting to harm or provoke the United States. The British were eager to have the United States on their side and may not have been above putting American lives in danger to accomplish that goal. Meanwhile, the Germans were more interested in causing trouble that would keep the United States preoccupied and out of Europe, perhaps inciting a large population of German Americans into rebellion, or provoking Mexico to initiate a war with its northern neighbor.
Sure. Well, remember, the United States and Mexico were not on very good terms at this time, too. There was potential threats and invasions, and even with, Tampico, an American troop presence. Germany was trying to exploit that relationship, as we saw leading up to, say, the Zimmermann telegram in World War I.
Wilson was not willing to accept this risk, and until threats subsided, sought cracking down on seditious speech, and roughly 1,000 individuals were prosecuted. Right. Following the end of the Great War and as the Russian Civil War raged on, inspiring far-left activities across Europe, a series of anarchist-inspired bombings and assassination attempts on prominent Americans were made, provoking a surge of arrests in an attempt to quell what many feared could be an anarchist or communist uprising within the U.S. The immorality of these actions are not...
Something like this happened in every industrial country. Some type of little Red Scare or a socialist movement, dare I say a communist movement. You're also going to get the closest a socialist ever gets to, open socialist to the presidency with Eugene Debs, who got something like 6% of the vote going into this too. Ran from jail.
Purely black and white. They were desperate actions during desperate times, not unfamiliar to American policy whenever it finds itself drawn into foreign affairs. One of the earliest laws passed in this country, after all, having been the Alien and Sedition Acts, meant to serve much of the same purpose when war with France was a strong possibility. To wholly dismiss the circumstances surrounding Wilson's reasoning for resorting to this decision and then moralizing it as merely bad is plainly unjust. In summary, Wilson's use of
unjust, but unprecedented, I think would be a fair thing there to say, with Alien, Sedition Acts, and things like that. Basically, speaking out against the government, speaking against the military in times of potential warfare for the United States, or actual warfare.
Government power was not without justification nor precedent, nor was it out of line with progressive governing strategies used by his predecessors Taft and Roosevelt. As was expected of a progressive, Wilson utilized federal power to produce efficiency, security, and greater prosperity for the majority, even if at the expense of a wealthy, deviant, or criminal minority. Wilson has been accused of intensifying segregation in government, giving rise to the Second Ku Klux Klan, and as
this is where you see him as a product of his time and place, being a Southerner with those sentiments out there.
Many like to say, being racist even for his time. On the matter of government segregation, the exclusion or disfavor of black employees, what was known as the Lily White movement, was by and large a product of its day, and more so of progressivism in particular. I touch on this in great detail in this video here, but to summarize, progressivism of the day was obsessed with efficiency and purity.
The progressive era of this time, again, turn of the century, was not one that proportionally held progressive movements towards racial minorities. That was still really something not necessarily on the agenda, or at least something a lot further down the agenda, and the progressives of that time being, criticized for that.
As the belief of many went, you could not have an efficient society or system if there were deviant factors which refused to assimilate and act in harmony with the rest.
That's what
Blacks were commonly seen as less American than most immigrants, said immigrants being largely white and thus able to blend more seamlessly into the American culture over time. Racial tensions at the time were very high.
But even that, you got to understand too, the idea of whiteness also was debated, because they're like, Italians, they're not, or, and the Polish, they're not, or even the Irish, are they this? It was so debatable, and it was such a modern construct, and basically used as a political tool.
Many blacks began moving in great number from the south to the north, and progressive politicians responded to this by ostracizing blacks from their ranks. Following a much criticized dinner with Booker T. Washington, Roosevelt caved to public desires and embraced the Lily White movement.
Yeah, that dinner, by the way, that he just has dinner with Booker T. Washington, Teddy, and that was controversial, big time controversial for that time period, just to have this official dinner there at was at the White House, right?
As dinner with Booker T. Washington, Roosevelt caved to public desires and embraced the Lily White movement. Taft did the same, and Wilson, also being a progressive, followed suit. While Wilson allowed Lily Whiteism to continue, once again we have an instance of if virtually any other progressive was in power instead of him, it would have happened anyway, and these actions are a product of the progressive culture of the time, not a product of Wilson being, quote, racist even for his time. One might even argue that Wilson did more for blacks than other progressives, in that he took a clear and vocal position against lynching, demanding state governors take action to end what he called a disgraceful evil.
Well, it's what people usually refer to as the segregation in institutions with that. I don't know if he's going to get to the whole like birth of a nation and airing it, in the White House, and how that was even like, racist for his day. Something else he hasn't mentioned too, and this is actually something Cypher, talks about a lot, cynical historian, in his kind of issues he brings up with Wilson, is that he was an historian. Like, he was an historian. He was like a trained historian, and then he taught at Princeton. He was the president there, I believe, right at Princeton. Knew about historical method, but even then, he was. It seemed like an historian that definitely was trying to be like advocate and be more of an advocate for his beliefs there, and maybe doing some of the things wrong that should leave out what you'd hope is more of the scientific approach to the historical method.
On the matter of the Second Ku Klux Klan, it is argued that Wilson gave legitimacy to the movement by hosting a screening of The Birth of a Nation at the White House. The movie, by the time of its creation, had already been a widely popular novel and play by the name of The Klansman. Despite its controversial portrayal of the first Ku Klux Klan in its final acts, the film was still hailed for pioneering a number of cinematic innovations, which brought it great attention.
So that was one of the things too about that movie, the content. Yes, that's one thing, and the objectionable nature about it. If know a little bit about it, it pretty much glorifies the KKK. You have to put that also in the context of film was a fairly new thing, and these type of pictures were something that people, the moving pictures was like mind-blowing to people, and be able to tell stories with moving pictures was something that people were, also talking about and glazing up this movie as well, from a cinematic approach and like a technological approach, alongside its content, of course.
Wilson had known the writer of the original novel that the film was based on, Thomas Dixon, as a university peer, and he was indebted to him for an honorary degree and speaking opportunity he had provided to him years ago. So when Wilson was contacted by Dixon requesting a screening of the film, he obliged, but apparently didn't know much else about the film other than it was a history piece about the Civil War and Reconstruction, subjects of great interest to Wilson given his background in American history.
Right. So yeah, he was, again, a historian, a university historian. But yeah, the famous quote from Wilson with the screening of that movie was, "It's like writing history with lightning." And people definitely attribute that to the content of the film, but also in the context, you can look at it with Wilson saying, like, seeing history acted out in film was like this huge idea, and it was like this huge, like, mind-blowing thing to see history acted out in a theatric setting like that. You combine those two elements, yes, the content, which again doesn't look very good, okay, but also its commentary on the invention of film itself.
Now, despite this, The Birth of a Nation was not even treated as the feature presentation of this first ever movie showing at the White House, but rather followed an earlier screening of the Italian film Cabiria, also hailed for its cinematic innovations.
I did not know that one.
The screening certainly did bring more attention to what was already a widely discussed film, praised for its use of new technologies and cinematography, not to mention being based on an extremely popular novel, though of course it's so much easier to say that it was Wilson's screening that made it popular in the first place. To say that allowing the film to be shown reveals a secret racism of Wilson's or that it promoted a secret agenda is nothing more than looking for patterns where there are none. And views have been further skewed.
I don't know. I think there's some fair criticism of it. I think so. But again, he is product of his time, came from the South, Georgia, right? Yeah, no, I think it's fair.
By tabloid allegations printed decades after the original screening and well after Wilson had passed away.
Wait, what did you say?
Tabloid allegations printed decades after the original screening and well after Wilson had passed away, claiming that Wilson said, "It is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all terribly true." The evidence of Wilson saying this being virtually non-existent, and the probability that he had said it is rather low, given that the portrayal of the Klan in the film deviates from Wilson's own historic writings. Now, to suggest that this showing gave rise or legitimacy to the second Ku Klux Klan is also a far stretch, and once again we find cause not in Wilson but in the progressive society of the day, which popularized the Klansman before it had even become a film.
Well, it's not just because of the film, though. There was a rise in the party and its presence in the South at this time period, too, not just because of the film necessarily. I think that's tying those things together. A little bit more correlation rather than causation, though.
Wilson, an apparently unassuming actor in this timeline of events, should not serve as a scapegoat for the some 4 million who would actually go on to join the organization and give it life. Wilson wasn't in fact racist even for his time, but rather in step with, if not more moderate than the popular beliefs of his day, and to single him out as is so often done is senseless ignorance. Wilson has been accused of recklessly pursuing war despite campaigning on neutrality, acting militantly against U.S. neighbors in Central America and the Caribbean, and ultimately paving the way for modern American interventionism.
Well, this is where there's a little bit of a duality of it, because he also actively kept the United States out of World War I, but then we also did see the continued American imperialism of Latin America, which was also kind of par for the course for American foreign policy back to Monroe Doctrine. The United States was going to focus its imperial endeavors on the Americas and expected Europe essentially to stay out of it. And by that same notion, the United States would largely stay out of European affairs, at least as much as possible.
On local intervention, Wilson inherited the border war with Mexico from the Taft administration, not to mention several floating interests and threats that resulted from the Spanish-American War of the McKinley administration and the interventions of the Roosevelt corollary. These lands south of America's border were terribly unstable and dangerous to both American citizens and economic interests within their borders.
Well, yeah, they are, first off, some of them even freshly out of their own independence movements. We're also dealing with a lot of the problems too of foreign imperialism, like say with the Mexican Revolution that's going to be happening here, which was very based on social class and economic classes. Basically elites in the government in cahoots with economic imperialist nations and economic outsourcing, not unsimilar to what we're going to see all throughout the world in the 20th century, which was countries and the people themselves feeling they are not receiving the benefits of the resources and the labor of their own country because it is being exported and in cahoots with other countries that have investments in there and have intertwined themselves with politics and potentially creating puppet governments, which the United States definitely was going to be a product of. With the United States, under the Wilson administration, being part of coups, and some of the first ones the United States are responsible for.
Thus, American efforts had since been focused on bringing stability and order to these lands on their doorstep. Wilson absolutely despised what he perceived as the militarism and imperialism brought to America by Roosevelt. Having grown up during the Civil War, Wilson came to view war as senseless destruction that was almost always avoidable, and as such hoped to abandon the military approach to Latin America in favor of arbitration, partnership, and the establishment of a Pan-American League. But these efforts ultimately fell short and proved insufficient to prevent the further destabilization of these countries, forcing continued military action.
No, it doesn't even, but that line doesn't even, that whole thing doesn't even fit in with the stuff that Wilson actually did.
This kind of interventionism is not unique to Wilson, but part and parcel of the progressive era. But unlike his predecessors, Wilson at least attempted to find an alternative.
Okay.
On the U.S.'s entry...
Okay, I guess so. There was no other alternatives than the coups Americans are going to be involved with.
To the Great War, Wilson from the very beginning sought neutrality and did all he could to maintain it.
Yes,
but repeatedly the Entente and Central Powers provoked American action. Right. Wilson had for years retained peace through diplomacy, even in the face of blockades, attacks on American vessels, attempts at provoking insurrection and protests within the United States, and attempts at provoking war between the U.S. and its neighbors.
But also the American government did not do their role in agreements that they even made with the Germans about trade during wartime there. All the illegal smuggling that was going on, the agreements that they were going to have that was supposed to end unrestricted submarine warfare that the United States repeatedly violated. Even with the Lusitania, with the information that came out about a passenger ship that was also smuggling war materials. These were problematic things there. But yes, Woodrow, I guess, could have done more to at least from his seat there, to be able to try to avoid some of the conflicts that are eventually going to bring in the United States, especially getting involved, even though it may be seen as indirect, in the wartime affairs of Europe, but also did try to stay out of it. I mean, tried to even campaign and wins re-election. And that was a major part of the re-election campaign, was keeping the United States out of the war. Because we know with the war, it was a gradual process towards getting into war, was never an overnight thing like Pearl Harbor, especially with the attitudes of Americans who wanted to stay out of it.
Wilson soon realized that despite his best efforts, peace could not be achieved through diplomacy alone. Germany was in fact directly and repeatedly threatening the security of America and its citizens, and thus the country must retaliate. Wilson did in fact run for a second term on the slogan that he, quote, kept us out of war. However, public opinion had quickly shifted in favor of war upon Germany's doubling down on unrestricted submarine warfare and the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram. The war was further framed as a conflict between democracy and tyranny, though this was largely a fanciful interpretation meant to simply bolster American support.
The mere thought of the Zimmermann telegram and a proposed alliance with Germany was just on its surface what pissed people off, because that was never even close to actually happening. The Mexican government had no interest in it. And remember, the telegram was basically from Germany to its ambassador, Arthur with Arthur Zimmerman, to the embassy, I think, in Mexico City. And then remember, it's Britain that intercepts it because they were tapping all of the transatlantic telegraph lines and communication lines, and then presented that to the Americans, of course, so they would get, very upset about it and hopefully inch them to war, because the war was a stalemate there in the West.
Wilson saw the conflict for what it really was, petty squabbling between great powers that grew too big for them to handle, and this understanding is reflected in his attempt to settle disputes as an outside and neutral arbitrator, and provide for the needs of all Europe's distinct people through a redrawing of borders and the establishing of a collaborative League of Nations, plans which the Germans favored as reasonable and which brought them to the negotiating table. But the victorious European Entente refused to concede their claim of spoils, and sought to treat Germany not with reconciliation, but with punishment and suppression.
Right, because they were seen as the aggressors. They saw the Central Powers as the aggressors of that war. And when you are seen as the aggressor and also lose that war, and understand this was the bloodiest war in history at this time, naturally the sentiment coming out of the parties most involved in the war, especially with like Britain and most especially with France, were going to be ones of very much hostility and try to hurt Germany so bad they could never do something like this again. And it's a totally different thing about what happens with the Treaty of Versailles, and as far as how it's going to lay the seeds for World War II and the resentment that Germany is going to have, as well as Italy, as well as Japan, and everybody that's going to have there. But I guess going into that conference, I'm sure he's going to get into the 14 points and how we know how many of those points are not going to be accepted. And a lot of the ones that even do get accepted were not necessarily what Wilson had wanted, and were not carried out evenly across all parties to actually prevent future wars.
Enough that I might never rise to challenge the likes of France and Britain again. Ironically, it would be these punitive measures by the Entente that ultimately drove Germany down the road to radicalism and drove Europe to the point of a second Great War. Wilson's decision to enter the war was not unjustified,
you can't put
and it
that
is
on
clear
Wilson.
that he had pursued every reasonable alternative up to that point, until finally he and a majority of the country determined that enough was enough. Wilson can neither be blamed for the Entente's refusal of his 14 points, nor for Congress's refusal to allow the US to join the League of Nations, nor the chaos which ensued in Europe in later years. In warfare and interventionism, Wilson was an idealist who did what he could to avoid conflict, promote cooperation, and ensure fair play by his idealized vision of American democracy. But reality collided with that idealism and forced him to resort to measures not at all unorthodox or extreme, but perfectly in line with the logic of his predecessors and with the tastes of his day.
I'm kind of surprised you didn't bring up more about like the 14 points and what he was trying to do at Versailles, because that's been one of the things that people talk about often, about a positive thing about Woodrow Wilson coming in. And look at the 14 points sometimes. You can look and see what it tries to do is address a lot of the issues that led to World War I, right? Long-term causes of World War I. May have learned the acronym MAIN in school: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, and how it was trying to address all of those points going forward. And we know that these things, some that were actually put into the treaty, were not done in a fair setting and almost become actually punishing, say like the self-determination. So self-determination was the idea that a people, a majority of people that are part of a country, an empire, whatever, when the majority of them want to become their own independent nation, that they should be able to do that. Now, they were hoping that that would quell a lot of the nationalist uprisings within empires, say like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where all this starts, in essence, more specifically with what was going on in Bosnia, and Bosnia wanting independence, trying to stop that, try to help stop those things. But the irony, of course, is that the self-determination did not happen in allied countries across the world. This is where you're going to get upset countries like India. You're going to get upset countries like Vietnam, as you saw Ho Chi Minh trying to speak for the Vietnamese at this time period too, and at this table, getting ignored there. But it only really took place in places that lost the war. So breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire gets broken up, and then even Russia, who fought on the Allied side until the Russian Revolution, gets their country ripped apart with self-determination happening in Eastern Europe, or the western part of Russia. But yeah, these principles were not applied evenly across the board regardless of if you're on the winning side or not. And that's where you see a lot of the implementation, I think, of the 14 points, the stuff that even did get implemented, done unfairly and almost weaponized, rather than becoming a clear-headed solution to problems to prevent future wars. And I don't think you can put that on to Wilson necessarily. Because what power does he have there? I mean, you saw the creation of the League of Nations happens. He wanted to create it. The United States never joins it. The big fear out of all of it was, well, first he had to get congressional approval, but the big fear from the American government and representatives in the government is one of the most important duties and rights and abilities that Congress has is the ability to declare war and to decide, the country's future and getting involved in wars. And the fear was that joining the League of Nations would basically take that ability away from the government and put it into another entity, this League of Nations, and the United States doesn't join it for that, although Wilson proposed it, wanted to be a part of that, which brings in a whole other conversation about could the power of the League of Nations been a lot more substantial if the United States ended up joining it. I don't know about that necessarily because there's a lot of what ifs in that, but we do know the League of Nations is going to be a failure. Again, things that were proposed that never go in that likely could have been a lot more help. Would it have completely stopped, like a World War II from happening? Well, maybe not, probably not, just for the fact that there's only so much like someone like Wilson could do, and so much power was still in the hands of the very upset British and French after the war.
We find the accusations levied against President Wilson to be great mischaracterizations based on a misunderstanding of his actions and the actions of his predecessors, based in a misunderstanding of politics and culture of the time, and based upon a narrow view of Wilson's administration and his personal character. Once again, I state that I do not personally align myself with the ideology and actions of Woodrow Wilson. However, I acknowledge that there is much confusion and misdirection regarding this historic figure, who by the standards of his day, executed the duties of his office effectively and well enough in line with popular consensus, as well as followed through with the agendas of the progressive movement and the agendas of the presidents who preceded him. Having additionally successfully promoted conservation, cracked down on corruption, and promoted labor rights and securities, including working to end child labor. It's clear why Wilson has historically been regarded highly as a president, and only in recent years has that reputation been wrongly warped.
Okay. My final thoughts. All right, so what I can surmise from sort of his thesis was that he was basically in line with the progressive movement that had already been going on for years in the United States. And so that they weren't necessarily, these were like unpopular things or things that he kind of like made up out of nowhere, or anything that he did was seen as even radical sort of for his time. That seems to be kind of his thesis. Now, after, I gave my comments and stuff, and where I guess I would put myself in kind of the Wilson conversation with this, of the analysis now that I've heard, where this one is much more like apologetic for Woodrow Wilson, but then also the things I've heard again from my other history friends. If you want to hear a big, really more in detailed kind of criticism of Woodrow Wilson, I would definitely check out one of Cynical Historian's videos he did a few years ago. That was a lot more in depth of the criticisms. And then you've heard the stuff in passing, I think, from Chris from Vlogging Through History and stuff. And I guess what I would say is I would put at least kind of my thoughts about the situation somewhere between, like Cynical Historian and obviously Monsieur Z. So somewhere in the middle there. However, I know that is a huge space to exist in, with the high criticisms, say, of like Cypher from Cynical Historian, then in Monsieur Z, finding myself probably somewhere in the middle of it. May not be very conclusive, but nevertheless, I would say that's where a fair analysis lies. All right, with that, you all, thanks for hanging out with me, and let me know what you think down below, and we'll see y'all next time. Bye.